Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the War Report. We're coming off a little bit of a heavy news week, nothing too severe, nothing like a couple weeks ago. But let's start out. First and foremost, I have two Canadians on the show to help me out with the Canadian elections. Number one, I think you know him, you love him, you're very familiar with him. That is our own GSP. And then you may remember him, those of you stuck around for a while. We have a good friend, well, Catholic expat on Twitter. We'll just call him expat for the sake of convenience, or CE because we like to give people abbreviations, legends, fascism,
Those are
FZ,
my
whatever.
actual initials.
It looks like we're getting a little bit of doxing territory, but
No, go ahead. It's good.
uh, but you gentlemen will not be able to see this. I'm going to pull up a Canadian election results. So the party stands in terms of seats. You have the Liberals 157, the Conservatives 121, Bloc Québécois with 32, the New Democrats 24, Greens won 3, and Independents won 1 seat. And you can tell for those of you in the audience that the Conservatives actually get more of a vote share than the Liberals. But of course, the Liberals won more seats. It's a parliamentary system, for example. Sort of the same reason why you can become president of the U.S. with the Electoral College, because it's state by state, district by district. It's not an exact popular vote. And if I understand correctly, Trudeau is going to form a coalition. Trudeau and the Liberals are going to form a coalition with other parties to prevent the Conservatives from coming to power.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it happens more regularly than not in Canadian politics. So we have a long history of this. It's not really by any means a power move by Trudeau. It's just to preserve um, his prime ministership, if you will.
Oh no, most Western governments are parliamentary coalitions. If you actually look at them, I mean, you go to the UK, you go to Germany, Italy, even I think like Poland. Like a lot of these countries are just no party has an absolute majority.
Right. And the conservatives will be, the whipping block here. They'll, it's basically to drive the narrative that the conservatives are always evil. They're the bad guys, and so on. Even though they, quite frankly, won the popular vote, I can say for the ridings in and around where I live, this is quite hilarious. I drove today and on Saturday through probably four different ridings, and of all the mainstream parties, and of course, in my part of Ontario, there aren't any Quebecois uh, parties at all. So there was only one. There was only one candidate with a European name of any kind, and, um, and he was a liberal.
White
There were
liberals, as always.
my particular riding has very very base Sri Lankans who uphold the values of the Conservative Party, and I and several family relatives voted for for keeping Canada, and yeah, that's the state of affairs in the Greater Toronto area, especially in the burbs. But what's interesting to me is how you have like these new struggles between Chinese that support the NDP and Chinese that support the Conservative Party and the northern part of Scarborough. Like I love like it reminds me. It's not quite as bad, but it reminds me of those videos where Mexicans and blacks and Chinese get into arguments over their service at a Burger King. It's kind of it's kind of like that, right? There's because literally at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, less than 20% of the kids getting coming out of the schools are European. So
I mean, the world is just becoming one giant LA, so there's
yeah,
that.
It's funny. It's funny. You talk about your writing and its lack of whiteness. It's funny in my writing in the suburbs of Vancouver, of the four candidates, only one of them had a non-European name, was non-European, and that was the People's Party.
Based minorities.
That was the quote unquote far right party that lost big.
Oh yeah, as you can see here, 1.6% of the vote with 0 seats. Now, just for background, People's Party, which is the quote-unquote far right, founded by Maxime Bernier, a former conservative who broke off after losing the conservative leadership election, which, my personal opinion, is sort of a dumb move, especially when you have someone as weak as Trudeau in power. If you just stick with it, if you stick in the party and keep your influence there, he's very easy to knock out, and it's very easy to get, maybe not to the seat of power, but very close to the seat of power. And I think I won't go this far because I don't know that much about him. It seemed like a bit of an ego trip to pull that move that close to an election.
Yeah,
yeah. I think maybe his overall plan was if he could swing a couple seats, he might be able to get some of the right wing MPs, the right wing of the Conservative Party, to jump ship and join him. That just didn't work out at all.
Yeah, and the perception.
Horses.
Yeah, I would agree. The perception here was, if you're voting for Bernier, you're just voting. You're throwing your vote away, and you're just going to help the Liberals. As it turned out, in the end, it didn't happen to make a great difference. Of course, it could have.
Well, it's actually, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm done.
I found there was nine ridings that the Conservatives would have won if it wasn't for the or eight or nine ridings where the Conservatives would have gained a seat if they came second to the Liberals, with the differential being the difference between the number of votes that went to the PPC.
Mm.
Yeah, and looking at that,
in the
7, 8, 9 seats wouldn't have.
So I think there were a few ridings that had affected.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it wouldn't have made a difference in the election, of course. But it would have been less, more of a. It would have been even more of a minority government for the Liberals.
Now, I'm actually a little bit surprised by the outcome because looking at it, I heard Trudeau is, of course, he has the insufferable personality a lot of people complain about, but from what I've heard from Canadians, you two included, that he's sort of just an inept leader. He really doesn't do much beyond virtue signals. Economic plan, from what I hear from a lot of other people, doesn't really inspire. I've seen the town halls and the meetings and the rallies does where he gets heckled oh, well, you said you would do this, this, and this, and he's like, oh, okay, and he gets on his high horse and makes up some excuse about some irrelevant social issue, but he was in a weak position. I think if the Conservatives would have had a stronger candidate, pretty much anyone but the guy they put up, Andrew Scheer, they probably could have pulled this off.
Yeah, Scheer is not an inspirational figure.
Yeah, no, they were throwing a total softball, and they completely muffed it by just not by just doing a horrible campaign and more of putting up a horrible candidate as their leader. Honestly, Harper would have done better if he were to somehow, if he would stick around or to come back. He would have probably done better than Scheer.
Yeah,
I don't think he would have won, but he would have done better.
I'll actually tell you what this reminds me of. This reminds me of the 2012 American election because you have a weak incumbent who's on the left. People have called Trudeau the Canadian Obama. And, I guess we could say kind of racial issues aside to make more jokes about that. And
he aspires to be a kind of white Obama or a blackface Obama.
And I would also say, if we're going along with the analogy, Scheer was kind of like the Canadian Mitt Romney, where he was probably the weakest possible candidate the right wing could have put forward, and it ended in this: the liberal left-wing party still won, but with less of a share than they did the first time. And interesting fact, Obama is the only president to win re-election with less votes in the Electoral College than he was originally elected with. So pretty much they were in that same weak position, and they both pulled it off by the skin of their teeth.
Right. And, I remember Kevin Michael Grace once saying how in Canadian politics it's assured through the rank system that no one like Trump ever will have the ability to get elected in Canada. And that's largely true. Anyone with any kind of, charisma, and yes, that would include a charisma that's polarizing. Since Trudeau has not been on the right, it's been on the left. And you could argue that, let's say after the 50s and 60s, that Trudeau is the only prime minister we've had with that kind of a charisma, leaving his politics aside and whatnot. But yeah, our system is even more of a kind of liberal but rhino system that you have in the States that ensures, no one is going to say anything out of the prescribed talking points, for the Conservative Party. None of them are sincere. Like any promise that they make that seems to run against the grain of, say, the liberal hegemony in Canada, isn't going to keep it. And they have to do so at the expense of being, for one, very pro-American in terms of foreign policy, and absolutely, unquestionably, very pro-Israel.
Of course. How could they ever betray their greatest ally? See, Israel's Canada's greatest ally too. Now,
Yeah.
I will say this. My general take on
Everyone's greatest ally.
my general take on it is Canada's elections are pretty much a glorified U.S. state governor election. Canada is all but a protector of the United States. It really doesn't have its own foreign policy. Beyond it, I mean, look, they speak out against, Trump has done such awful things, abandoning the Kurds. You had the Canadian government saying that a couple weeks ago. But beyond that, you don't get much. They're even less defiant than countries like the UK, countries like Germany. At least they have a bit of a spine. Western Europe have at least the weight to stand up to the United States to some extent, especially within the context of the European Union, for better or for worse. But the only difference I see is even a limperist conservative like Scheer would have been slightly more pro-American, more willing to work with Trump probably, whereas you'll get Trudeau, who will ultimately kiss the ring, but he'll morally grandstand about how the United States, Trump had said such mean things, and he should really step up as leader of the Western world, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the thing also, about Canadian politics is that, I mean, we're not leaders in any in any important way, except for some disgruntled Americans in the entertainment business. But we still have to.
Lena Dunham moving up north.
Oh yeah, Whoopi Goldberg. Yeah, it's. Of course, they'd never come here, but
yeah, it's a threat.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the nature of Canada. It's. I think Canada was, when it was more of a British colony. In some ways, it was what happened here was more vital, and it had more autonomy. The more it became a kind of de facto American colony, or a colony of whatever the most left elements of American politics, the more relevance it's lost, and for amongst other reasons, primarily because it's social cohesion. After the 70s, Canada also began to become extremely diverse, and like as I've said before, when I arrived, Canada was like 95% white European. Toronto was 95% white, and that seems just absolutely unreal for a lot of people living in say in Canada or America, but it was the case. And the changes, especially where I live now, are so overwhelmingly dramatic. If you're of European descent, you are absolutely a minority. You are not even within the 30% bracket. You are 20 if you're lucky. And so, in a sense, that that whole, you know, uh, the economic Western idea of a free shopping zone with liberal values holds fast here. And I just wondered, like, who in the end would really fight for it if it came down to that.
Oh,
And I think that's the essential weakness of liberalism, is that one of the only ways it could possibly change is a threat from the outside more than from the inside. Because I think they know that's their inherent weakness, is that internally, although the people get along because the quality of life is very high, the quality of community is very low, and the cohesion is not that great. And if it came under threat, I don't see Canadians banding together. We're not, nothing of the sort that happened in World War I or II, or even the Canadian volunteers during Vietnam. It's just not going to happen.
now I'll tell you two types of people who would fight for liberalism. Number one, first and foremost, is the mercenary. He will fight for, again, soldier of fortune for a reason. Number two
Yeah,
are the non-Westerners who are trying to get citizenship through serving in each country's respective military. We have a lot of Latin American volunteers trying to get American citizenship, and I believe like Central America, Guatemala, that part of the world is pretty prominent for that sort of thing.
yeah, yeah. It's I mean, you can even see it the way it's being played out right now in American geopolitics, right? Um, in some, in some ways, maybe the peak for American dominance really was the first and second Iraq wars, and that's the country is so profoundly changed right now that there isn't, and you can see this with the European powers as well.
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
There isn't a cohesive. Everybody's a mercenary, right? Like, I mean, for the right money, they will fight for the empire, but that wasn't the case 50 to 100 years ago.
Oh yeah. Now, moving on, still on the topic of Canada, I brought on our special guest for a reason. He actually broke a little bit of a story to me about Alberta, if you'd like to go into that.
Uh, yeah. So I'm from Western Canada, GSP being from Ontario, Southern Ontario. Uh, and for the longest time, there's always been sort of, I guess you could say, four Canadas. There's Western Canada, there's Ontario, there's Quebec, and then there's the Maritimes. Uh, and ever since, well, even going back prior to the 70s, but going back even to the 20s and 30s, but especially ever since the 70s, there's been a great or a noticeable divide between Western Canada and the East, meaning Ontario and I guess Quebec. Uh, Now, I should say this divide would be felt least of all in Vancouver, just due to its ultra liberalism and being. I mean, if Toronto's the most diverse city in Canada, Vancouver's the second most. Um, but back in the 70s, this is when sort of Alberta starts. Alberta is probably Canada's most right-wing province. They will consistently vote for the Conservative Party in federal elections, and they generally have a right-leaning government in the provincial legislature. And back in the 70s, it also should also say that their economy is based very much on oil. Nearly a third of all jobs there to this day are to do with the oil sector.
It really is the Texas of
And
Canada.
it can be, I guess, yeah, it's the Texas of Canada. You can pick up trucks, farms, guns, and oil. So basically, in the 1970s, this is when Pierre Trudeau, Trudeau Senior, was in power, and he passed several. I guess you could say his government. They undertook several policies that were very much or I guess you could say the Albertan people, and not just the Albertan people, but a lot of the Western Canadian people were very much in opposition to these policies. One of them being the Multiculturalism Act and the bilingualism. We have official bilingualism here in Canada, so even in Vancouver, if I go into a Safeway, a local supermarket, and buy some milk, I can read it in French, even though I don't know a single word of French. They have to have French packaging on everything as part of this bilingualism. But the one that was most the Albertans were most angry about was his. I'm not an expert on this. He passed an effective national energy program, or they started this company called Petro Canada, which was like a national oil company. You can hop in here, GSP, if you might know a bit of this too. This plan was viewed by Albertans as robbing them of their wealth and distributing it to the other parts of the country, mainly Ontario and Quebec.
Right. And I have a friend that way back in the 90s was a politician in the Reform Party, and he was originally from Alberta. His family moved to Ontario when he was 10, and there was always a very strong animosity towards Eastern and Central Canada. The Petro-Canada thing was one of them. And it's interesting because the separatist thing kind of died down, and we've had this issue with the Quebecers. But just to put it into perspective about how maybe underneath Canada is divided, prior to the election results yesterday, the West Wants Out, which is a Vote Wexit face group page, had 2,000 members. Today, it's at 170,000. It's at 170,000. It's literally ballooned. So, I mean, there's the same kind of feeling that people are expressing all across the West. That this isn't their country anymore. The idea that, as one person put it, the idea of Canada has died in the hearts of many Western Canadians. I mean, Albertans have also talked about joining the U.S., but after the recent transgender court case in Texas, do you really want to be known as Texas at the North? I don't know where.
I'd rather an independent Alberta.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it will get stymied, absolutely. And just to put it in perspective, I don't think that Albertans are as nearly as nationalistic as the Quebecois were at one time. So I don't see any kind of success. Of course, I would rather see that happen. But we're just an incredibly cucked country, and I just don't see it happening.
Now,
unfortunately,
not to get too LARPy, but maybe as all hell breaks loose in North America over the next few decades, we'll get the Chinese communists funding right-wing separatists in Alberta.
Okay, that would be epic.
Or British Columbia. That would be based. No. So what also I was going to also get at was divide going back to the 70s was also that I forgot to mention that during the 1970s and into the 80s, the population of Canada was such that if you could win the majority of ridings in Ontario and Quebec, you would become you would get a government. And so the Liberal Party, these policies like the national energy policy, did actually negatively affect Alberta and probably either have some sort of positive effect in Ontario and Quebec due to the fact that they wanted to remain in power. And at the time, there was no voice to really be had in Alberta and Western Canada because Ontario and Quebec had all the seats. And so I was going to actually bring up this whole Western exit Facebook thing. I was on Twitter last night looking at all the Alberta separatist posts and just grinning. I truly believe that, yes, it's a very, very, very low chance anything like this could ever happen. I think for it to actually gain a lot of traction, we would need a number of things. We would need this is, I think, very likely. We would need the next leader of the Conservative Party to be someone who is incredibly weak, viewed by the majority of the Conservative electorate as not being someone who is it possible who stands a chance of becoming Prime Minister. We would also probably need Trudeau to go harder on his green eco climate crap, which would be to the detriment of the Albertan economy. I think too, this would really help it too if we had a nice recession. We had a nice, just the right level of economic recession to get the people kind of angry. That could really get the ball rolling, I think. But I don't really see a referendum happening or anything like that in the future. But it's something to keep your eye out in the next couple of years as this government forms and as Trudeau enters into his second, like I said, not term, but his second government. So
Albertan accelerationism is the plan.
Sorry? Yeah, I mean, I think it's indicative of something else. Like, I mean, I think it's indicative of the fractures that are just going to increase with time. Like, them, like Alberta not, acquiring independence from Canada, shouldn't be our focus. So, I mean, obviously the likelihood of that is, very low, but it's kind of like the election results in that we have a government back in power that isn't there by popular demand, and it's it comes down to that old Rubicon of big major cities wielding power over the smaller cities in the rural areas, and even Southern Ontario is pretty disgruntled with the Liberals. Like, I would say, you go just outside of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, and it's very PC. It's very progressive conservative. I know that it sounds like an oxymoron, but and it is. But it's very blue in Southern Ontario, except for that area from Hamilton to Toronto and parts of Oshawa. But in a sense, the Liberals have become, in some ways, the unofficial party of Canada, if you will.
Oh yeah, I can definitely understand that. Now, I wouldn't say there's really a similar case in the United States, but I suppose you could say, for example, in Germany, like the CDU is sort of like their unofficial party, or there's definitely similar cases where you'll just get this party who rules more often than not. They may lose out an election or two, but are still a strong opposition. But unless you guys have any other thoughts on the Canadian debacle, my two Canadians here, I got a couple other news items we can move on to.
Yeah, I'm good.
Well, the only other thing I'd say is, I think GSP mentioned this briefly, but at one point there was a time when there was a referendum on independence of a province in Canada, and that happened in 1995 in Quebec, and it nearly passed. So it's not like we haven't granted a province the right to we have at one point given the province the right to choose its own path forward in the last 25 years, and so I don't see it happening, but there is it leaves the door open for if there would have been independence movement again. They would have I guess the right to demand that, hey, it happened once before, why not let us have a vote?
And actually, It's interesting that Quebec also was flooded with various
The block.
with
Oh,
various economic migrants and immigrants from
oh,
former French colonies shortly after that to basically ensure that that would never happen again,
yeah.
because no matter how francophile those minorities are, they are never going to vote for an independent Quebec.
I mean,
Yes.
all I can say to finish this out is I can't imagine how gay a Canadian Civil War would be.
Whoa, come on.
But what I was saying would be funny is if Canada ends up balkanizing before America does.
Oh, interesting.
Now,
Well,
wouldn't
and
that be something?
who knows? It'd be interesting.
I mean, this who knows? Maybe America balkanizes, and we come in like the vultures that we are, and swoop down. Like we burnt down your White House.
No, no, the Anglos did. Don't take credit for what the Eternal Anglo did.
Yeah, don't take credit for Anglo success.
That's true. That's true.
Okay, but moving on. Speaking of Anglo-American imperialism, we got a little bit on Syria. A little disappointing news. Now, the big news that came out is the United States will be keeping a couple hundred troops in the Omar oil fields, or these oil fields in yellow, to make sure they don't fall in the hands of ISIS or they didn't outright say it, but probably that Assad guy. They probably don't want him to have the oil. No, I mean, look, you don't know what he's gonna turn that oil into chemical weapons. That's how they do it. But beyond that, the ceasefire between Turkey and the SDF has been lifted, and you can see like with these blue bombs and fighters and flags on the map that Turkish advance has begun again. You can see the fighting. What is interesting though is activity. Russian and Syrian airstrikes have picked up around the Idlib province, or the Idlib area, that they're really pushing there. Despite the fact that they've made gains in northern Syria, despite the fact that they're in a lot of these key northeastern Syrian towns, the focus is still heavily on Idlib. And on top of all that, Trump approved $4.5 million in funding to the White Helmets, which, considering the irony is how hard we've been going against Turkey, the White Helmets affiliated the same groups that Turkey is now having their invasion supported by.
It's truly pathetic. I mean, of course, what more can Trump do? In a sense, he's showing the cracks in the alliances and the cracks in American hegemony as well. But you know, rightfully, those are Syrian oil fields, and they don't belong to Kurds. The Kurds have used them, of course, to gain their version of autonomy by even booting out other ethnicities in that region. So it's a damn shame. I mean, Assad has regained some oil fields, but in some towns like Manjib. But you're right, and we spoke about this way back, even before this Turkish offensive, that not only would it be very difficult, but that in fact, although it would stretch Syrian resources, that a more concerted effort on Idlib would ensue, and that has happened.
I mean, when was the last time anyone in the mainstream talked about Idlib? What, Trump a few months ago, and he said, "Oh no, don't you go into Idlib"? Nobody cares. It's all about the Kurds. It's all about the SDF. It's all about Turkey. It's all about northeastern Syria right now. They could not give less of a damn about northwestern Syria, which, if you want to get conspiratorial, it's west of the Euphrates. Possibly another river. Maybe our greatest ally is in that formula, but I digress.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we also shouldn't forget that there's a UN committee that's is meeting on the constitution for Syria. There's like 150 parties that are involved in this, and many of them are also enemies of Assad. Russia helped formalize this last year around this time, and that's going on. And in some ways, it's true. Syria will never be the same country again. it's going to be interesting to watch how long America stays there. Um, Not that America had that many troops in northern Syria, but the effect of just announcing that they were leaving um, was incredible. The kind of panic it caused in the Kurds, and the kind of boldness it gave to both the Syrian and Russian forces. And then, they've capitalized on that, and rightfully so. So it'll be interesting to see if, like, what would it take for America to leave completely, or, if Lindsey Graham gets his way, what would it take for America to re-enter? And honestly, I think one of the reasons why impeachment against Trump has accelerated is primarily because he has dragged his feet for a more, open and hostile war in Syria, to win whatever kind of vision for Syria that the Americans had. And that hasn't happened. And I think that's probably on the top of the list of disappointments. And not just, for the American elites, but for Israel as well.
Yeah, and just to point out, that green blotch on the map in southern Syria near the Jordanian and Iraqi border, there is a more unofficial U.S. presence there. Of course, there's an official U.S. presence in Jordan and Iraq, but that little blotch is being propped up to keep, of course, the Iranians from having full access to Damascus, because you can see the highway runs right through it from Iraq into Syria. And second point is, just by having a couple hundred troops in the oil fields, that prevents any further leverage the Kurds would have in negotiation with the Assad government, of course. We initially thought the Assad government was going to get their oil fields back in their entirety, but as it stands, I think Trump is doing the bare minimum in order to still be a functional president. He's done, to his credit, as much as he can. Now, this isn't to spare him from any criticism, but in this case, I believe he has genuinely done as much as he can. And another story out of Syria, this is from South Front. The Syrian army and Russian military police deploy on border, and this is their words, not mine. Putin and Erdogan reach a, quote, historic agreement on northeastern Syria. So Erdogan was in Moscow meeting with Putin actually today, but the deal will take effect at midnight Syrian time, which I believe we're already past. I think it's about a 7-hour time difference, but by the time the show's here, it will definitely be in effect. So, as predicted, it seems like Russia and Turkey are working through this crisis diplomatically. That's nothing I wouldn't have expected. And things have definitely slowed down, especially with the ceasefire. Now, again, the ceasefire is officially ended, but it's not full force like it was pre-ceasefire. Again, something I'll give Trump slight credit on. And, of course, he had Pompeo and Pence contradicting Trump. Surprisingly enough, Pence usually keeps his mouth shut, but Pompeo, no surprise, was contradicting Trump on the Kurds again. But things are definitely going in a different direction than I expected. I figured that the U.S. would completely cut its losses. I thought the neocons were at the point where they realized Syria was lost. I mean, you could see them pivoting, like with the protests in Lebanon, which we may cover, that their focus was really taken off Syria. Their focus is definitely taken off for Iran right now, and it seems like they really want to go gung-ho against Turkey, which is interrelated to it, but it still seems like they're very hard on the anti-Assad rhetoric. I don't know whether it's just like the sunk cost thing. They think they've invested so much that they might as well stick with it. But I honestly expect them to, even like the most ardent neocons, saying, okay, Syria isn't worth it, we've tried it, and we're out. But that was me giving them too much credit.
Right. And, Turkey up until this point has seized about 900 square miles of territory since the 6th of October. This is a plan that was floated around last year, and it was discussed several times in a deal with the Kurds. Initially, Turkey and Russia had discussed, along with Syria's approval, to have Russian and Syrian outposts on the border with Turkey, and that the Kurds could literally keep their land, which isn't their land, and the Kurds refused it. So now it's been forced upon them, and yes, I mean, absolutely, Turkey and Russia are going to work out what's best for each other in this situation, and the Kurds are like, America's not going to step in for the Kurds. Let's be honest, right? And neither is Europe, for that matter.
Yeah, and
Um,
just to continue on that, a lot of people on our side, especially, say the troops are tripwire. They're there so they can be a sacrificial lamb, so we have an excuse to go to war. Granted, that's a reasonable line of thought. I can understand why one may think that, but I think if they actually did try to do that, a false flag, if you will, or luring them the danger in order to use them as justification for war, I think it would have the exact opposite effect. I think people would question the war effort, what we're doing there, and call for an immediate withdrawal. Like a lot of people even don't even know we're in Syria, didn't know we were in Syria until we actually announced the withdrawal. That's how covert of a war has been, if you will. And I think if something like that were to happen, even just maybe I exaggerate here, even just 20 or so troops were to die in one day, the American people haven't seen that high casualties since Vietnam, and of course Vietnam had much higher casualties. But we're used to the one, two, or three every once in a while in Iraq or Afghanistan. Not downplaying those, but point being is, recent American wars have had much less bloodshed on the American side as compared to wars like Korea, Vietnam, and especially World War II. Something people haven't seen in decades.
mhm. Yeah, and Turkey is no longer in that position where it's able to pivot to set America against Russia and Russia against America. Now, that's an important distinction. And this meeting in Sochi that's taking place, of course, Erdogan is going there, and the New York Times is, careful to describe what that meeting is like. Apparently. Putin is looking very relaxed, and Erdogan is conscious of, sitting up very straight and eyeing, his Russian counterpart constantly. There's no question that Russia has become the power broker now, to a great degree. America's power being what it is could change on a dime, and quite honestly, I think if impeachment proceedings are going to go forward prior to Christmas, or like just prior to Christmas, let's say late November, and thereafter, we could see a sudden change. That's a possibility.
Now, I'm glad you said both those things. Now, first off, I misspoke earlier. The meeting was in Sochi, not Moscow, and that actually does have more significance than just location. And you said Putin looked very relaxed while Erdogan looked very uptight. Now, when Putin has a meeting in Sochi, it's either with close allies, like you've seen him there with
Yeah.
the Iranian leadership or Assad, but if he's in Sochi, it's usually he's having a relaxed meeting with a close ally, or he's confident that he hardly needs to put any effort into negotiations. Now, when they're in Moscow, when they're in, for example, Vladivostok. Now, granted, Vladivostok was more a matter of geography with the meeting with Kim Jong Un. Believe it or not, the location, even in the United States, any country, where two leaders meet is important. I mean, Singapore was important because it was a neutral player. Trump meeting the Taliban at Camp David would have been important had that actually gone through. Trump having Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago while he's bombing Syria in 2017 was, love it or hate it, an absolute power move. But
Mhm.
yeah, beyond that, and I'm also glad you brought up. A lot of people have been saying, for better and for worse, that Russia has become the new king of the Middle East. Putin is the king of the Middle East. That he will solve the disputes, and that he's sort of in charge there. People are saying, "Oh, the United States gave up its leverage, gave up its power as an arbiter in the Middle East to the Russians." Not like that wasn't happening already, but I'm glad you brought up those 2 points. And the third point I'm glad you brought up was the impeachment thing, because you recall right before Bill Clinton's impeachment proceedings, he dropped quite the payload on Iraq.
Right, right, and I honestly
Baby
think
food
that
factory.
with that. Go ahead.
No. You just mentioned the bomb a baby food factory in Iraq
Oh, yeah.
in 1998 or 99.
Right.
Yeah.
It was
That's right, and it was the last factory that had powdered milk. It was just so despicable, and of course, the stupid shitlib supported it. I whether I've been on the left or the right, I've always been against these wars. I don't know. Anyways, yeah, I mean the dynamic there has changed. In a way, maybe Russia has called America's bluff. America of course, sent troops in. They supported what allies they have. The allies have not been effective. And, worst of all, America has wooed away a NATO ally. In fact, the most important NATO ally in that region.
Oh yeah, the dagger
Um,
pointed right at the underbelly of Russia.
right. And so, before Russia even stepped in, there was speculation. Like, I mean, if Turkey wants to, they can just, close the Black Sea, and Russia's not going to get in there. Turkey could have made this very difficult, and in a way, even Turkey's disgruntlement with NATO and with the EU is showing, and this is part of this ongoing drift that Turkey has been under for several years now towards the east. So, and it just and Americans are exhausted of endless wars. The vast majority of them. The only people who have a problem with this are New Yorkers who are upset that Putin won again.
Yeah, I mean it's
the
upper
vast
class
majority
liberals.
don't want a war in Syria.
Yeah, it's upper class liberals and think tanks.
Yes.
Now, I will say this.
Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of Erdogan sort of swearing off the United States and the West, he still does have one ace up his sleeve. That is the Iran issue. Now, you think things are going well. Generally, they are. But Iran is still not happy with Turkish military action in Syria, especially compared to Russia, and even compared to the Assad government. Iran was pretty much locked and loaded when this offensive first started to go in and defend Syrian territory. So let's see how that plays out, and that could potentially be one thing Erdogan could play, at least the United States, saying, "Oh, look, we can help you counter Iranian aggression if you help us with X, Y, and Z."
That's a good point. So a lot of this is going to depend on Iranian leadership to decide, just how much they're willing to risk, because the fallout of, say, taking this bait that Turkey might do to gain favors with the U.S., with NATO, might not be worth it. At the moment, Iran is in a vice, and they don't have a lot of room to play with. So the question is, do they want to die on this hill?
Yeah, I think with Rouhani, he's a bit more measured. Now, there's some elements in Iran that are very Islamist, do take their sort of doomsday prophecy very seriously. Now, if they were in power, I think that would be a bit more of a concern. But especially with Rouhani, who's, again, a middle-of-the-road sort of figure, and with someone like Soleimani, who's been fighting in Syria since the beginning of the war, and who has a lot of on-the-ground experience, and is probably one of the, love him or hate him, one of the best military commanders of this era. He's definitely going to advise against that, and he's up there. I mean, he's the commander of the IRGC, like in the Levant. I think they call themselves the Al-Quds forces, which is the Islamic term for Jerusalem, but that's beside the point. But with him and presumably other Iranian military leaders, they're probably going to strongly advise against it.
Yeah. It's not a move. It's not they don't have the luxury of doing that. Also, as Lebanon becomes more unstable, this isn't the right time. There's a real potential of Hezbollah being involved in another conflict. It would be an internal conflict, and that would suit Israel very well. So, the situation in the Gulf is still very tenuous, especially after the last attacks on its tankers. And of course, the Iranian nuclear deal is still up in the air. Sanctions are still being piled on. I don't see. This would be a grave mistake on Iran's part.
Oh yeah, with the focus shifted to Turkey and northern Syria, Iran, now granted it's not that much, for the first time in several years has been given the opportunity to actually take a breath, and I think they'd be well advised to just lay low for a while.
Right. They still have a stake in Syria, and they still have troops in Syria, and that in itself is very different than what it was in you know, 2014, 2013, and things are only looking up. It's been very slow and very gradual. It's been, a slug match. Um, but it's in Iran's best interest. None of these players, Russia, Iran, Turkey, if they work in concert, they can literally get more of what they want than if they oppose each other. They have far more to lose uh, if they are offset against one another.
Yeah, it as it's kind of what I was saying last week about Russia and China. In on paper, it is a tenuous alliance, but real world factors considered, the matters of the world we live in considered, that's not relevant to discuss right now. Again, give it a decade down the road when American power may decrease in the Russia and China case, they may start to side eye each other and become more adversarial towards each other. And I think it's exactly the same case between Turkey, Iran, and Russia right now in Syria and the Middle East. Yes, on paper they have all these disputes, all these oppositions to each other, but right now they're not in a position to air those out. And there's a bigger common threat, which is the United States and I guess you could also say Israel, and just the situation in Turkey in general. Not Turkey, Syria in general with the West. So yeah, give it some time as the U.S. If the U.S. withdraws, that is, we may see these conflicts pan out. But as for now, I don't really think it's worth discussing.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I think that wraps up Syria. Now let's move on to one of the bit more wild stories we've done in this show's history, which is what's going on in Mexico. Now I don't have any graphics for this, but there was a botched arrest raid on El Chapo, the drug lord's son, which led to, of course, the cartels storming in to go free him. And people are saying this is the beginning of the Mexican Civil War. I mean, and for the people, like, for a lot of, especially like the urban liberals who are like, oh, Mexico is just a great and peaceful and prosperous society. Now, why they need to come here if that's the case, I don't know. But point being, for the people who deny the heavy cartel involvement in Central American governments, especially Mexico, this is a testament to it. With only firing a few shots, I think very little casualties on either side either, the Sinaloa cartel bested the Mexican military.
Yeah. If you want an image of the future. Yeah, it's
when you hear about all this,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Go
Okay.
ahead, Ekta.
Just when you hear about all this violence down in Mexico that's been ongoing for a very very long time, and it seems to be either getting worse or not getting better or not getting much better. I've always wondered, like, how long are the people of Mexico going to put up with this? On what you said, Constantine, about this being the first shots of the Mexican Civil War, I've always wondered. I don't know how it would if it would kick off or how it would kick off, but I've always wondered, even going back several years, if there is to be some sort of conflict in Mexico, how the massive wave that would send into America if there was an actual armed conflict. If Mexico became an active war zone, not just an active crime zone, basically.
Now, to further on the story, Lopez Obrador, the president of Mexico, I believe it's Antonio Andreas is his first name, AMLO, if you will. He, who was the left-wing populist leader that got elected to Mexico last year, actually called off the arrest raid after. I think he actually called off future arrest raids after the failures of this one. So again, whether by he's in their pocket or fears them or just realizes the impracticality of it, he's soft on the cartels. Any Mexican politician that isn't owned by them is being blackmailed or threatened by them. The cartels are quite literally a terrorist organization. I would hazard to say, the biggest national security threat to the United States of America are the drug cartels in Central and South America. Now, I am not an advocate for the use of military force in most cases, almost all cases. I think our conflicts in the Middle East are pointless. I think our increased aggression in Eastern Europe against the Russians is pointless. I say a fair amount of our military activity in East Asia and the Asia Pacific is pointless. But if there is anywhere we need to be using military force, I say you talk to these establishing conservatives who love the war on drugs. I'll tell you my proposal. We have an actual war on drugs. Instead of just busting some low time dealer or somebody smoking a joint, why don't we use actual military force against the cartels in Latin America, at least the ones in Mexico? And at this point, I wouldn't even say with cooperation of the Mexican government, because the Mexican government has clearly proven itself incompetent to deal with the threat. And with the drug overdoses, with the violence in America that spills over the border, I say at this point, the United States, out of all the military engagement we take, would be more than justified in directly engaging the cartels.
Yeah, I think how much of America's military is Hispanic?
Uh, I think it's actually proportional. I think the military is almost entirely proportional to the United States with a slight overrepresentation of whites. So, I don't know, probably 15-20%.
Right, and 23 out of 24 of the Marines that were, I forget which military branch, was helping migrants get into the U.S. at the border.
Yeah, they were also involved in arms smuggling to, I think, actually the cartels. So,
Right, and they were Hispanics.
yeah.
So, that tells you everything. Um, it's it's like with Rome and the Germanic tribes, except it's Mexican cartels.
Now, I will go as far to say this. This may be nitpicking a bit, but I think specifically if we used air power, I think the demographics of the Air Force are a bit more white, if you will, because the pilots are pilot trained officers. So if we used air power against them, especially against their facilities, even just like bombed like their, like processing plants, or like where they grow these drugs, or like where they ship the drugs, rather than actually like targeting the gang elements, the cartels, I think that would be a lot more effective.
Yeah, I don't see how that would ever happen. I think that moment is past.
Oh no, I mean, I have no illusion about it happening, and as much as I hope it does, as much as I hope we actually use our military force for a useful purpose, I'm under no illusion that Trump will order strikes on cartel drug facilities tomorrow.
Yeah.
But yeah, if there's a case for border security, it's the fact that a full-on narco war. I mean, beyond Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel just besting the Mexican military, you forget that a lot of these cartels, a lot of these gangs and groups fight amongst each other. Of course, you throw in some of the small elements of some of these um, Amerindian separatist groups, especially like in southern Mexico. I think there's still like an Aztec nationalist movement or some crazy thing like that. But I would say that Mexico is a civil war waiting to happen. I mean, I think there's hot points around the world, if you get what I'm saying.
Mhm.
But yeah, I know Colonel McGregor has been saying that civil war is imminent in Mexico, and he has pretty good judgment. He's been doing this for much longer than I have, and has actually been doing this in professional capacity. So I put stock in his word, and that'll be interesting to see, especially if it breaks out before the election. That may actually give a boost to Trump. That may actually give Trump something to run on. Just thinking purely politically.
Well, how would you classify it as a civil war? Because it's almost like a civil war. What's going on now? We
Mhm.
just have to have more factions fighting over control of the country. I'm guessing, but again, you sort of have it already with the cartels.
Yeah, I mean,
It would just be interesting to see whatever the flashpoint would be for that.
at that point, just more of an all nationwide gang war. So point taken. But still, in terms of like the rhetoric, politicians could use for it, especially here. Now, not that like they deliver on those promises, but I think the point stands.
I just
Yeah,
want to
I
know
mean,
which
I guess
faction
in a
the
way.
Russians would.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I was looking for which faction in the Civil War the Russians would support, just so I know who to root for.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, you know what narrative I'm surprised they haven't run with. that Russians are funding the cartels. I'm surprised they really haven't run out with that yet.
I actually saw that. I was actually watching a live stream that said Russians are funding the cartels. You know what? I gotta say, mad respect. Mad respect. Like it's just Putin is just he's just awesome. How is he getting away with all of this?
Again, cartels.
What a madman.
Welcome to the global liberal alliance, El Chapo. You'll find many friends here. You'll find Putin, Xi, Rouhani, Orban, Salvini. Again, we're all united in our hatred of liberalism. But beyond that, the one last thing I think I'll close out the show with is there's a little bit of Brexit news. Now, turns out the Parliament actually went forward with some variation of Boris Johnson's deal. Now, keep in mind, we're 9 days out from Brexit, as Johnson says. He says, deal or no deal, that the UK is out on Halloween. Now, I am inclined to believe that. I actually am inclined to believe that, but I'm surprised that the UK Parliament was actually able to come together and pass something with even just a slim majority that benefits the British people.
Yeah, but it hasn't. Aren't they delaying the vote yet again?
I think they were considering it.
Delaying the.
Oh,
That's
I don't think it's the vote; it's the timeline is pushed back, something like that, for when the Brexit actually happens.
Oh, I actually didn't see them delaying the timeline, but come to think of it, I'm not surprised.
They asked for a delay. Was what I heard. Sorry.
Yeah, but point stands. The obligatory Brexit mentioned, we really don't have much to say beyond it, beyond the fact that, I mean, at what point, like, I don't even think they're trying to force a second referendum anymore, because I think if they're trying to force that, they would have gotten already. I think they're just really just trying to drag this out until they put up the white flag.
I would sadly agree. Yeah, as of today, it's this MP's block Boris' plan with plot to thwart October 31st exit. I mean, Boris is never going to come up with any deal that's ever going to be approved. That's just how it is. It will simply never be good enough, and so it's going to be a slug match. You could look at it that in the long run, this will just harm the EU, the EU's legitimacy, Britain's legitimacy, confidence, and so on. The longer this stagnates, the longer this isn't resolved. BAP had Franz Bird had an interesting article that he just published, and he was talking about how the whole Pepe thing was in many ways similar to what was happening in the Soviet Union during the 70s and 80s, and that there's a growing number of people who see a systemic breakdown of, and we're seeing this with liberalism. In the end, that's what all these issues are. America pulling out of Syria, Brexit being delayed, Brexit even happening in the first place. So long term, you could say that even if there is no Brexit, there's a discrediting, there's a breakdown in morale by the people, and all of these issues are going to have their consequences, and it will all come back eventually.
Now, I also will say this as a final point on the Brexit thing. I saw some rumblings out of France that Macron may just be about to say fuck on the whole thing and actually want to force the UK out because he's tired of dealing with the issue. Now, Macron being the pragmatic neoliberal, as contradictory as that sounds, I'm inclined to believe that he would hold a view similar to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're even, I'm even seeing, graphs indicating that, that there isn't going to be one. That slowly the population's mind is being changed the other way, which is a common occurrence in Brussels-led votes in the EU. Um, I did have actually one little thing to bring up about recent European news, and that's the ascension of North Macedonia and Albania have been denied by Macron. Balkan Insight had a very based. What the fuck? I keep liking Macron even more. Um, Holland and Belgium were also part of this bloc.
I mean,
Uh,
I can't believe Macron has become a Russian puppet. Why would he? Why would he assist Putler in keeping these great countries out of the European Union, if not just put them in the hands of the Russians?
right, and this is another example of this kind of desperation that's happening right now. Right, like if you look at America and you look at America's rise to power, right, it first goes deep. That is, it first consolidates its power with the 13 colonies. It has a civil war. Its essential consolidation of power only increases. Only once this is firmly established does America then tread out and expand. Right? With the European Union, they're trying to expand without going deep, and in a way, all of Macron's critics for this are entirely wrong. Because the truth is, uh, Serbia, for instance, has all kinds of chapters that are developing inside the EU. Meanwhile, it has a massive arms trade agreement with Russia, and has heavy, Russia input in Russian times. Um, so you can see all the neoliberal takes and think tanks and publications like The Economist, where this was a horrible mistake. But the truth is that the EU's expansion has been entirely superficial. It's weak. Its strength is probably at its height between Germany and France and a few other countries, and now you have Britain like in limbo for the last 3 years. I think what Macron did, even from an EU neoliberal side, was actually the correct move to make.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I'll actually go on a limb just on while we're on this topic, just kind of close out. You know what I think actually might be the death knell of the EU?
Mm.
If Ukraine gets admitted, I think that'll just be like critical mass. I don't think they'll be able to handle it anymore because it's such a basket case of country. I think that might finally be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
I think so, but hot take. I don't think they're going to permit them.
Oh yeah, I mean they would be foolish to, and like I said, with the more pragmatic neoliberals in the vein of Macron, sort of carrying the torch now. I don't think it'll happen, but if by some long shot they do, I think Ukraine might be the undoing of the EU, which would be the ultimate
Absolutely.
irony.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to rule it out. There's still a possibility. Maybe that possibility will increase once Putin is out of power. I don't want to be dismissive about it. Um, However, for the next 4 or 5 years, I honestly don't see it happening. I could be wrong, but
Or alternatively, another major crisis in Ukraine that caused more emigration might be a straw that breaks the camel's back. I mean, they learned their lesson from the migrant crisis. Like, yes, they love the cheap labor. Yes, they love bringing in people who they can play against each other. But at the end, even someone like Merkel realizes that at some point it's just too much to manage. So we could see that if there's another mass exodus from Ukraine. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what direction this goes. But I mean, even just beyond Brexit, because I think in everyone's mind, even the British people's mind, Brexit has just become an afterthought. It's like, oh, it'll happen one day. Just who knows? But yeah, I think that all the EU needs is one major thing like that for it to shatter.
yeah, it's on a collision course. Also, Merkel was responsible for turning, the young men of her country into a minority indefinitely, and paradoxically, that state of affairs has actually what has forced the EU to be more conservative. It's out of pure necessity that they cannot admit, Kosovo and or Albania or North Macedonia into the EU. It's untenable, and so who knows where all of that is going? I think it's great that Macron blocked. He's clearly one of the best Russian puppets in Western Europe at the moment. So yeah.
Who would have thought? Macron just being the wild card, the European Erdogan. But that's all I had to say for today. Quite a packed
Implying
show.
that Turkey isn't Europe.
Yeah.
I'm remiss. How could I ever make such a flawed mistake? I can't really call him the white Erdogan either, because Erdogan's pretty fair skinned for all things considered. So I guess we can call him the
Yeah.
manlet Erdogan. I think he's shorter than him. So I guess I got something.
Yeah.
But that's all I have to say for today. If you gentlemen have any closing thoughts, now's the time.
No, that's it for me.
No, just interesting to see what's happening. Obviously, I've always been interested in what's happening around the world, but now it's going to be interesting what's happening actually in Canada. So it's finally something possibly maybe interesting happening in the country in the next few years. So
Yeah, and my prediction, I don't think I'm officially made this, but I said it on a group chat with somebody that I thought it was going to be a hung parliament, and I am wrong.
yeah, well, I mean, at the same time, I don't just. I mean, I want it to be interesting, but at the same time, it's most likely just going to be even more gay than I imagine. So
I don't know. We may slight chance get a coalition battle out of this, but I'm not expecting it. But beyond that, this has been episode 77 of the War Report. Double lucky number, I guess. So thank you everyone for tuning in. See you guys next week, and
Thank you.
goodbye.
See you guys.